knowledge is power. If somebody wants to book you on a session and you can read music, then you can play anything they put in front of you. But if you can play by ear, you can also do whatever you need to do, pretty much so.
Fantastic. Joe, I'm glad you're here because what you have done in the industry is you've preserved legacy of great musicians that has allowed future generations to be a part of seeing where music came from and what the true history of our art form is about. Welcome here to the session. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
Now, I know you played music early on. So tell me about how kind of music got in your life.
Well, at this taping, I'm 63. So if I make it to July, I'll be 64.
Good for you.
And so I'm in the middle of the baby boomer generation, I think. My first music memory was Hound Dog with Elvis Presley. Music always meant more to me than it did my friends. We went to recess at grammar school. You know, they're playing kickball. Obviously, I was not athletic. I wanted to go listen to music on my father stupidly gave me a transistor radio with the earplug, so I was listening to the Beatles instead of the math teacher, you know, and in class.
Yeah.
You know, my brother had a guitar laying around the house, and he didn't learn it, but I kind of took to it. Took over my whole thought process was music, and back then everything was on AM radio. You could hear everything on.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so even country crossovers that were big enough would make it, so you could hear Tammy Wynette and The Who and Hendrix and Otis Redding and the Temptations all on the same.
Wasn't that a great time?
Yeah, it was great.
I mean, I'm the same age as you. What a great time that we lived in that had that kind of a wide variety of music. On AM radio, and AM, you just picked the radio up, you turned it on, and you had several stations to choose from that had all of that wide variety.
I couldn't wait to turn the radio on every day because there was always something new. And you know, the prior in the 50s, I mean, I don't really know how to define, there was popular music, but the genres that we listen to now really were created from maybe my birth date and forward.
Yeah.
And you know, and it was great I didn't realize it at the time because it was happening, you know, and then I just knew that the music, you've heard of somebody like Michael Jordan talking about being in a game, a championship game, and he's going up and making a layup, and he's thinking to himself while he's doing it, remember this, because being in the moment. And I kind of, when I look back on it, I kind of realized that I was musically in the moment, remembering, I just knew that this music that I was listening to was better than anything had come before me, in my opinion.
And still.
But not to knock the big band stuff. I mean, I appreciate all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I didn't listen to what my parents did, but my kids definitely listened to what I did.
Yeah.
So there is some kind of appeal to that music that's
absolutely.
That crosses most generations to some degree.
And that defined, because in the decades that we have, you know, the 50s, what was created at that time, which was that almost that rockabilly country vibe that was happening. Mm-hmm. Then the 60s, when the Beatles hit and that changed. The 70s had its own decade of music, the 80s, so there were decades of sounds that happened.
It was a gradual morphing of, you know, everybody always uses it because it is a good example, but you had How Much Is a Doggy in the Window, which is, you know, not really cool.
Yeah.
And then you had Rock Around the Clock.
Right.
And
which was cool.
Which was very cool. And then you had, you know, the Elvis, and then you had the Letterman, and then from that you had the Everly Brothers, who influenced everybody.
Yeah.
So you had Elvis and the Everly Brothers, and then the Beach Boys from the Everly Brothers. Mm. And then you had the Mamas and the Papas, and it started Southern California sound. And then all of a sudden you've got the British invasion coming in. And then you had Motown really starting in the early 60s, maybe late 50s.
Yeah.
And then Stax, which was a little grittier Motown.
Yeah.
And then Muscle Shoals. I mean, it's just all these genres of music just kind of, they kept folding into something new.
And the Muscle Shoals stuff is still influencing people today.
All of it is.
Yeah,
I mean, and then you had the Southern rock thing that happened. Yeah. And then you had Zeppelin and Korean. I mean, it was a constant metamorphosis of music happening.
Yeah. So you were listening to all these different bands. Mm-hmm. So were you playing with different bands at that time?
I started a band when I was 14. We ended up winning this, there used to be a civic organization called the JCs. I don't know if they're still around.
I don't know yet.
Like the Kiwanis clubs, you know.
Right.
But every year they would have a battle of the bands, and that was back in the day before there was internet and all that. You know, you didn't really know how to make it. It was just, you know, you had to know somebody, or so the only way you could get any recognition in Columbus, Georgia, was if you won the Columbus, Georgia
Battle of the Bands contest. Yeah.
And so that was my goal in high school, was to do that before I graduated, and we did. And then we won the Nationals that same year, and that kind of prolonged the band's longevity.
Yeah.
Without going into great detail, it's a short story. Our keyboard player's uncle managed to Conway Twitty. If you don't know who Conway Twitty was, he was a wannabe Elvis. He had a huge hit called "It's Only Make Believe" in the 50s, just like Elvis. And then he decided that he was going to be a country artist, and he had, I think, more #1 country records than any other country singer.
Wow.
One of our trumpet players in our band said he had a third cousin that lived in Nashville. He never met him till the day he died, to his cousin, but he said he had a cousin in Nashville that was in the music business. He was what they call a producer. And so we didn't know what that was. But he was Steve's cousin, so I accidentally met him walking into CBS Records. He was sitting in the lobby because there wasn't any windows in his office, and he listened to me trying to get somebody to listen to our newly recorded tape we had just done the night before in Atlanta. We were walking, they turned us down like they do everybody. They said, "You have to leave it." We said, "Well, we can't leave it. We got to be in Muscle Shoals tomorrow to pitch it to somebody else when we only have one copy." That's how smart we were. And so I had the front door opened, and the guy that I had spoken to when I walked in, sitting on the couch reading a billboard, was listening to what I was telling the secretary. And so when she said, "You have to leave a tape," we said, "Well, we can't do it." So I turned around, I was opening the door, and one of the guys that I brought with me from the band was talking to the drummer and said, "Hey, what was Steve's cousin's name that lives up here?" And he goes, "I think it was Billy Sherrill." And the guy reading the billboard dropped it and said, "I'm Billy Sherrill." And so a week later, I'm recording in where Dylan did in Columbia A, and then that changed my whole life.
Talk about fate.
Yeah, the door was open and I let go of it, and then Billy kind of ended up being my second dad, and he was the BMI Songwriter of the Century. He produced all the great Charlie Rich records,
Wow.
all of Tammy's big records, George Jones, Elvis Costello, Marty Robbins, Johnny Paycheck, Barbara Mandrell. I mean, he produced everybody.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
And so he let me hang out with him in the studio. I was the only person that, for whatever reason, I guess I've always looked at it like I was like no more danger than a dog laying around on the floor, because I wasn't going to tell anybody anything because I didn't know anybody to tell anything. So I was harmless, and so Billy would let me hang out and just listen and watch him produce and listen to the studio musicians. And then he would also listen to my attempts of songwriting, as would Conway. And then when I got to a point that I guess I was writing pretty good songs, they started recording them, and then they hired me at CBS, and I got to start producing records. And so I used the same players that Billy did. You know, Pete Drake on steel, and of course there's Kenny Buttrey, who ended up playing with Neil Young, and just all the great session players. Pig Robbins on piano, Bobby Wood.
These are legends of great musicians that were doing it at that time. Wow.
Yeah, Bob Moore on bass, Henry Strzelecki on bass, played on the Dylan stuff. Charlie McCoy on harmonica and guitar. And Charlie's the reason that Dylan came to Nashville. Was he played on Desolation Road in New York with him, and then Dylan was so enamored with the way he played, he came down to Nashville and did the Nashville Skyline, Blonde on Blonde, John Wesley Hardin, and Self-Portrait, all because of that. And then when Dylan came to Nashville, that's when Nashville became in vogue. Dylan's stamp of approval made it to where everybody wanted to come.
About what year was that?
66.
Okay. That was the time when Nashville started to be really seen more as a music city.
Well, after Dylan came here, everybody started coming here.
Right.
And I mean, it was cool, even though we've always been rock and roll. Bebop Balula was recorded here, in 58. All the great songs that Brenda Lee did. And of course, you know, she was a huge influence on people like Elton John. And after Dylan came, there was an explosion of studios getting built because the demand, everybody was here, which also meant there was more work for more studio musicians.
With the level of studio musicians that are based here in Nashville, and the reputation that Nashville has. I'm from New York, and we had our fair share of studio players. As the studio business kind of crashed for what it is, there's still a scene here that is so embedded in the history of Nashville that's powerful.
Well, Pig is still doing sessions, and Pig's probably 80 years old. But when you hear Pig, you hear Behind Closed Doors and Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue and all these bass. I mean, he still is great, and he's blind. and I don't know if you know about the Nashville number system or not, but
yes, the chart reading number system. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was something that some of the guys came up with here. Different stories on who, but so I won't say because I don't really know exactly who it was. But it's so much quicker, and it's so efficient. And instead of writing, say, an A, D minor, E, somebody came up with the idea of write 1, 2 minor, 3.
Yeah.
And then that way, if the singer didn't sing in an A, they just go move it up a step, move it down a step.
And it was easy to
and they didn't have to transpose anything.
Right.
If you've ever been in a Nashville session, the players, they don't have their instruments in their hand. They're sitting there with a pen and paper and listening to the demo and writing the numbers out, and then when everybody gets done, okay, y'all ready? And then somebody has to come up with a different intro to every song, every session.
Yeah.
I don't know how you do it. and I think what's also just unbelievable is somebody like Pig who's blind, and if it's a difficult song and the other guys are like, oh crap, what was it? And they're all asking Pig, and he doesn't write anything down. He just sits there and just hears it and he's unbelievable.
Well, there's a gift that he obviously has, and part of it because of the challenge of not being able to see, they develop senses at a much higher level.
Oh yeah.
And to have that skill is amazing.
Yeah, Pig's something else.
So you're playing, you're doing it actively as a musician, and it sounds like with all that you're going through, that this history part of what you've been able to experience in your life is planting some seeds for a future project that you might not even know you're going to do.
This was, 40 years ago and 100 plus pounds ago, I was going to be a rock star. When I kind of figured that wasn't going to happen, the Songwriter thing happened, and then, like I said, that opened my eyes to the whole world of recording. And I had a full career of that, and then the music business can be feast or famine. I had my 15 seconds, but I wasn't the most prolific writer in town, so there's a lot of competition and more writers here than anywhere.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do something I had a little more control over, and so, but I didn't want to get out of music, so I had a chain of guitar stores, and then being the founder of a museum was never even in my thoughts.
Wildest dreams, right?
No, I didn't even know what a museum was, other than a canoe and an Indian arrowhead or something, There was a couple of things that happened, and that was learning about the players and how, everybody would go in the studio at the same time. And everybody would feed off everybody. And you've heard that rising tide lifts all ships. Well, when you're in the studio and you're with that caliber of musician and somebody hits a lick, it makes everybody's game go up.
Yeah.
Now today, if you're sitting in LA and you're going to phone in a part, you're going to do it during the commercial break of a TV show you're watching, and you're not going to have the fairy dust sprinkled on that riff that you would have had you been in the studio with everybody at the same time. I don't believe. So I think there's been a lot of sterilization of tracks. There is something to also be said for everybody being in the studio and having a little bleed over from one mic to the other that gives it a live feel, and maybe not use a metronome. Humans are not.
Human time seemed to work very well in those early recordings, and as it was years ago when everyone was in the studio together and recording. And you're right, that bleed of that sound as it came in helped make that sound. The fact that there wasn't that metronomic sterile time. That was a magical time that isn't really happening now.
Technology has helped in some ways, and in some ways it's hurt. Obviously technology has killed it financially. There are no record sales anymore.
Anybody can record from their home, from a computer,
Which is, I don't think that's so god awful bad but some of the earliest, the greatest records that were made in the 50s, 60s, 70s were done in really dives, as far as the building goes. You go to Muscle Shoals Sound, it was a casket storage building, and it had concrete block and ceiling tile. You go to American Studios in Memphis, I actually have the interior, a lot of that interior in the museum.
Really?
It was a weird thing. The last guy that owned it bought it the day before Elvis died. When they were going to demolish the building, it was on 827 Thomas Street in Memphis. He knew that the history they had, I mean, Dusty Springfield had done Son of a Preacher Man, The Box Tops, The Letter, Neil Diamond's Sweet Caroline, Brother Love's Traveling Salvation Show, Elvis, Suspicious Minds, In the Ghetto, Kentucky Rain, song after song after song.
Legendary songs
in there. And so he had his son take the vocal booth out, which really consisted of two walls stuck in the corner with a door and a window, so it was easy to remove.
Yeah.
And then took down the walls, which were basically ceiling tile and plywood, and had them stored in a tractor trailer about 60 miles northwest of Memphis. I tell everybody in Tornado Alley, how they lasted there for 35 years before I got them is unbelievable. I would have thought it had been blown away. And then we recreated it, or just reassembled it in the museum. And you get to see, really what
it was like.
What it was like.
Yeah.
And you're actually looking at the walls and the vocal booth. Now, Elvis hated going in the vocal booth, as did all the singers.
Yeah.
Because they wanted to be out in the studio with a baffle in front of them with the musicians.
Yeah.
They didn't want to be one wall between them.
But to feel that as a singer, to feel that with the band, that's a part of the magic that's created.
Yeah, and most times, or a lot of times, the scratch track vocal was the one they kept.
Yeah, absolutely.
Other than maybe punching a word or two in or something,
Right. But the change of what had happened with how music has changed now and how they recorded, and the separation of each instrument, the sterilization of the sound of each instrument and what it is, it's changed. And I don't want to sound like someone saying, well, the way it was years ago was so much better, but there was a magic that was created then that really was unique.
Yeah, and I think that I call it spontaneous creativity.
Yeah.
And that's when you're in a group like that, like I said earlier.
Yeah.
Somebody does something that sets the whole band off. I mean, it's just indefinable, and it's only there for a while, because the more you play a song, I know that Phil Spector would drive everybody crazy doing 40 takes or something, and until he drove out their thoughts, supposedly, and they were just doing mechanically what he wanted them to do.
Right.
So I wasn't there.
Yeah.
But when Skinner, they finished up their album, and then after they had just finished the album, they wrote Sweet Home Alabama. And Ronnie, the singer, said, that's gonna be on the next album, but we're not gonna play it for a year and then record it then. We're gonna record it now while it's got the magic.
Yeah.
A year from now, we'll have played it so many times, we're just gonna go through the motions.
Right.
So they kept that in the can for a year before they released it, but it had the mojo on it.
Yeah. And that's really where the magic began, with that first take, that spontaneity that was so fresh with the creative process. That's amazing. So here you go, you start organize this. 2006.
Well, we opened in 06, yeah.
Yeah. So in the preparation of this museum, where did the idea for the museum come about?
I knew about the studio musicians because I was lucky enough to be able to hang with them and be there. I'd actually, like I said, I had some guitar stores, and so I had we sold guitars to everybody, and when I got into the vintage guitar market, I ended up selling and knowing people who were selling guitars to the Stones and the Who and Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young and all that. So not because of anything I did incredible, because I was a great musician or writer or anything. It was just because I was dealing in guitars and I knew these people. It's just who you knew, so I got invited to hang out with these people. Well, actually, HGTV came on, or some cable show, and I used to sit around and watch all these home improvement shows with no intentions of ever improving my home. I enjoyed watching somebody else work, but not me. And I thought, well, if I did that, people who maybe don't play instruments, they might, but especially those who do, because since I was able to call Chet Atkins a friend, and so I asked Chet one day, I said, man, I'd like to do a show for musicians, but something that regular people would watch too. I'm going to interview James Burton. People wouldn't maybe know who he was unless they were diehards or Elvis fans. But if you had a blue screen behind, or green screen, whatever behind you, and you had a picture of Elvis and him behind you, then somebody, if they were changing channels, they go, well, yeah, that was Elvis. And then they'd listen.
Right.
And then you could ask James, how did you decide to use this gauge guitar string? Why this guitar? Why this amplifier? how'd you come up with Susie Q?
Get into specifics, yeah.
Yeah, and then you could ask some Gurmy questions that anybody would like to know. Chet was totally into it, and everybody else that I talked to were all willing to do it, and I just didn't have the backing or the knowledge to pull it off.
Yeah.
And by the time when I did figure it out and that cameras were affordable to do what I wanted to do, Chet had gotten sick, and I just didn't even want to ask him anymore.
At that time, yeah.
And that morphed into brick and mortar. I thought, well, I can do the same thing tell the same story with a museum.
Yeah.
And the thing that kind of triggered that was that Hendrix, again, lived here in Nashville. A lot of people think Hendrix in Nashville is like oil and water, but he said that this is where he really learned to play guitar.
Yeah.
And he was stationed in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, about 70 miles from here. So when he got out, he and Billy Cox, who became his bass player, starting with Woodstock, they played around here in what they call the Chitlin Circuit. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, the Chitlin Circuit. Yeah, yeah.
So if you don't know what that is, it is small little restaurants or places that black-owned restaurants that serve fried chitlins or catfish or something like that, and had music.
All the time, yeah.
All the time. And they were located in neighborhoods and all around. And so Jimmy played all around Nashville, Murfreesboro, Tullahoma, Clarksville. His house that he lived in a house called Joyce's House of Glamour. It was a black beauty salon over on Jefferson Street. And he and Billy lived on the second floor. And when they built the interstate that went across Jefferson Street, the house was still intact. Eventually they tore it down. And I said, how could that have happened? I mean, that would have been such a great gold mine for that part of town to be able to have something there that would draw tourists from all over the world.
Right.
And it got torn down because there was nobody here that knew about it or had the ability to save it.
To make it happen, yeah.
That's kind of what made me think about, well, maybe I should open a museum here and talk about Hendrix and Pig and everybody else. And then, like I said, it just kind of morphed into why not everybody. And so instead of being a, quote, Nashville museum, it's a musicians museum that's located in Nashville.
Smart. The Musicians Hall of Fame. I mean, think of that, what you did. So how'd you start getting gear and equipment to put it in?
Well, I tell everybody that everybody has to go on vacation sooner or later, and I'll break in. But that's not true. And actually, I spent all my kids' money. Some people are financially able to donate. Some people aren't.
Yeah.
And I understand that. When I did start, a lot of people were not giving the studio musicians any
credit at all,
at
any
all.
recognition,
So
nothing.
The money, I mean, you could get a rock star guitar for, everybody wants that. Nobody really cared about the musicians, the studio musicians. So when I first started, it was easier somewhat to obtain. All these guys looked at their instruments like tools. That's instead of taking a hammer and a saw to work or a briefcase, they took an instrument.
Right.
And they looked at it like it was a tool that they made a living with.
Absolutely.
Especially when you're behind the scenes, you don't think, well, this is going to be really special because I played it. They were very humble and and it just never crossed their mind.
Yeah.
Maybe not so humble now that all the documentaries have come out, but I don't blame them. But all those great guys have already passed too. That was. We're still lucky at this time of this filming that Hal Blaine is around and Joe Osborne.
Absolutely.
But so many of them have gone away, and luckily I was able to get with like Larry Knechtel and Uriel Jones at Motown and people and get those instruments, and they were really dying for that to happen because they wanted to see this happen. They were so happy to know that people would find out that what they did, and without them having to tell somebody and feel like they were bragging or somebody wouldn't believe them.
Right. I mean, think about the songs that Hal played on you. I mean, and we had a chance to interview Hal Blaine, and the stories. His memory is vivid and sharp of all that he did.
And you've heard the Ladies and Gentlemen Hal Blaine tape that has about 5 seconds of incredible, iconic records that you think's never going to end that he played on.
Yeah.
And you're thinking after about a minute or so of hearing 5 seconds of standards, okay, well, it's over. No, it's not over. No, it's not over yet. No, it just keeps going and going like hell. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. What in the museum? What would you say are some of the favorite pieces that you have in the museum?
Honestly, the thing that I think that we have gotten the most publicity for was that we've had two locations. The first one was downtown by the Country Music Hall of Fame, and then the city chose to make a new convention center on top of me. So they took it by eminent domain, and I had to rebuild it again, which has been fun. But I went to Printer's Alley where Hendrix, one of the very first pictures of Hendrix on stage was in the Jolly Roger Club in Printer's Alley. So if you go, you've seen Printer's Alley.
Absolutely.
Okay, you saw the sign that says Printer's Alley that goes over the street like Bakersfield.
Right.
Under the Y of Alley, looking east, is a window that's bricked halfway up. And that used to be a door that went down to the Subway Club in 1954. And then in 1962, there's a picture made of Jimmy and Billy Cox and a guy named Moses Leonard, the three guitar players in this band on that stage. And so it's in every single Jimi Hendrix book, documentary. They were turning it into a condominium, and I had bugged the crap out of this guy for about a year and a half. And so I happened to call him one more time, and he said, well, they're down there tearing it out now. And so he says, just go down there and get whatever you want. So I had the crew cut out everything, the wall, the ceiling beams, the doors, the stage, everything's in that picture. I had it, went down and picked it up, and then we reassembled it. And the BBC did a half-hour program.
Fantastic.
The Man Who Saved Hendrix Day.
Yeah, fantastic.
It came from outer space, you know, kind of a title. But everybody, they can't believe it, because we do actually have the stage that Hendrix played on in 1962 at the place that he said he learned to play guitar. So what I love about it is that it shows kids and adults both that you don't start necessarily at Woodstock. You start in the Jolly Roger Club downstairs in
the Chitlin Circuit. Yeah.
Right, Chitlin Circuit. That's been really popular. The other thing was kind of the same thing as the American Studio, when you can actually go in a place that doesn't exist anymore. You know, so we're also about to open another section that has a mobile studio that was built by a guy named Brian Ahern, who was married to Emmylou Harris and was her producer, and over 40 gold and platinum albums were recorded in this mobile studio. It's actually a semi-tractor trailer, built in 1972 in Canada, moved it to LA. You could pull it up to somebody's house, a barn, auditorium. They did Black Sabbath Live, they did Willie Nelson Stardust album, George Jones and Friends album, where they actually pulled that up to Bradley's barn studio here and used it as the control room, and the barn as where everybody performed at.
That's amazing.
And so it's got an incredible history, and so people love being able to actually walk through, be somewhere that you can't go anymore.
Absolutely, to witness the magic of what had happened at that time. That's incredible.
It is. You know, when I first did it, I thought, well, they're going to think I'm a fruitcake. You know, but they probably do anyway. But they'll still like that. So, and then I guess instrument-wise, you know, there's some people that come in that actually, you know, are well aware of who we have in there. And I mean, and to be able to see Joe Osborne's bass that was on Bridge Over Troubled Water, well, most all the great Simon & Garfunkel records, most all of the great Carpenter's records, even when he moved to Nashville, Lucille, Kenny Rogers, I mean, it goes on and on and on. And the history and the stories that are, you know, that was the bass that he didn't change the strings on for 14 years. And because the deadness of the strings became part of the sound.
Absolutely.
Because you heard them on so many iconic records. And the story about when he went into a Carpenter session, who he and Hal discovered, you know, were the Carpenters. Yeah. Did Hal tell you that?
He did tell us that story.
And that he passed on producing?
Absolutely.
Who gives a crap about brothers, sisters?
That's right.
So he said Joe said he changed the strings on it because they were just getting way too hard. I mean, he boiled them and, you know, so many times. You can bring a bass string back, you know, for a while. He said he's had a hard time really getting it in tune, and so he put new strings on, and as soon as he hit the first note, Richard Carpenter hit the talk back Put the old strings back on. Because that was the sound.
Was the sound they were looking for. So you captured all this here, and you've maintained this. This is an incredible part that you have grabbed history for future generations to really experience and feel what this is about. You know, this session's interviews are about this next generation being aware of what you've done and what all these different artists that I've interviewed here, to hear their message and many of the names that you've mentioned, for them to go into the research of who these people were. What would you say in closing, Joe, to this next generation that have this, you know, glimmer of passion in their eyes to play music? What would you say to them that they can prepare for them to reach some of their goals in music?
Maybe I should just say what people that really matter said to me. And like, you know, Chet Atkins and Les Paul both said this pretty much the same thing. There's people better than we are. You just hadn't heard them yet. But, you know, we happen to be at the right place at the right time. But both of them both said pretty much the same thing, and that is to practice, learn how to read music. Knowledge is power. Yeah. And you can work more if somebody wants to book you on a session and you can read music, then you can play anything they put in front of you. Yeah. But if you can play by ear, you can also do whatever you need to do pretty much. So, you know, you can do everything. So just study your instrument and learn as much about it as you can. And as Les said, just keep on picking.
Well, listen, you have done an amazing amount of securing a part of this industry's heritage and history. You probably never thought you'd be on that path or that you'd be doing what you're doing. From playing guitar to selling guitars to now, you know, having guitars and this is real Americana history that you've captured here at the Musicians Hall of Fame. You've done it, and you're continuing to do it. And for that, we thank you so much for that effort, because that vision that you have is going to help future generations to enjoy what came down before them. And that's really where the magic begins. Joe, on behalf of the sessions, we thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great job.